property manager. And what do condominium property managers, what is it within the scope of condominium property managers? Thankfully, the Real Estate Act of Alberta, section 1, subsection 1E2, provides a definition of some of the activities which fall in condominium property management. And in essence, this could be broadly defined as exercising the powers of a condominium corporation or using those powers on behalf of a condominium corporation. And this can include things like enforcing bylaws or rules of the corporation, entering into contracts on behalf of the corporation, supervising employees or contracts that contractees who've been hired by the corporation, or collecting or attempting to collect any condominium contributions which have been levied against owners. And I noted from the outset that these regulations are going to affect condominium property managers. It's important to mentally separate the management of condominiums from the management of any other type of building. So if you're engaged in both condominium property management and commercial property management, you would need two different types of licensing. And the new model that's largely been introduced is really, the way I think of it is, and the way I think is most applicable to people, is it really seems to me to fall within that traditional scope of model between a real estate agent and a brokerage. So realtors are individually licensed, but they also have a brokerage who's going to hold their license. So for instance, one realtor can be individually licensed, but Remax could be the brokerage who's going to hold their license. Now in Alberta, it's going to be largely similar for condominium property managers. So the property managers are going to have to be individually licensed, but also if you're providing condominium management services as a company, you are also going to need a separate license to hold a brokerage license. So if you are a condominium property manager, you may need to be personally licensed, but if you intend to set up a condominium management company and provide wider services, you're also going to need to obtain a brokerage license. Have you obtained both of these licenses? Well, there is some training and licensing requirements. And there's 3 licenses that are available to people. There's a brokerage license, which is the person who's going to hold the brokerage, operate the brokerage. There's an associate broker who meets the requirements of being a broker, but isn't necessarily operating as a broker themselves, and there's an associate, and this is what most people would think of as a traditional condominium manager. So they are a manager employed by a brokerage. There is some new educational requirements that are in place. Importantly, there is some conditional licenses at present. So these regulations came into effect on December 1st, 2021. These licensing, the conditional licenses are in place until December 1st of 2022, and this is to allow people with a conditional license an opportunity to obtain a full license. In order to do that, they're going to have to pass perhaps a number of exams. And really the number of exams that you will have to pass depends on where you are in your property management career. So for new condominium property managers, they might have to sit as many as 3 exams. For individuals who are already in the industry, it could be 1 or 2 exams. And importantly, it should be noted, there is some exemptions from these licensing requirements. And important exemptions are going to be if you work in the condominium industry, but don't necessarily meet some of these criteria. So for instance, if you are a court-appointed administrator, you are going to be exempt from these regulations. Where all the units in a condominium are owned by the same person or corporate entity, you're going to be exempt. And also where your only service is attempting to collect money on behalf of a condominium corporation, then you are going to be exempt. And that sets out a very, very brief overview in relation to what these regulations mean. Very brief overview of what the model looks like, some of the educational requirements that are going to be in place, and importantly, what some of the exemptions are. And I'm going to turn over now to Doug Dixon of RECA, who's going to further discuss why the regulation of property managers was necessary, provide some of his own personal insights in relation to the licensing process, talk about them in a little bit more detail. And he's also going to give some insights in relation to how he foresees the future of condominium property management in Alberta going. Doug, I'll pass over to you at this stage.
Thanks, Niall. So good afternoon. Welcome to a high-level overview of the regulation of the condominium management industry in Alberta. I'm going to start out just describing who RECA is. So RECA has been responsible for the regulation of the real estate industry since 1996. We later added mortgage brokerage and most recently condominium management. RECA's main focus is promoting the integrity of the industry and protecting consumers. This has been accomplished through licensing standards, education, practice review, and compliance. The new governance structure that came into effect December 1st, 2020, which replaced the structure that had been there since 1996, has 11 public and 12 industry members. Each sector regulated by RECA has an industry council. So condominium management for all types of condominiums falls under the residential property manager industry council shown at the far right. So it's a bit of a misnomer, but I don't think government gave some forethought that condominiums fall into different categories: residential, commercial, industrial, and mixed use. And so the decision was made, because of the nature of condominiums, it was best to keep all the condominium management under the same council. So in Alberta, this is the definition that's been put in place for condominium management. It's nothing that anybody would be surprised by. The big things are collecting, holding, and dispersing funds, enforcing bylaws or rules of a corporation, negotiating or entering into contracts on behalf of that corporation, or supervising employees or contractors. So this will be a bit of a living definition as we move forward, because the industry is new to regulation in Alberta, and there'll be lots of things around the fringes, I'm sure, that will have to be interpreted as to whether or not they fall under condominium management or not. And as Niall mentioned earlier, there's a distinction between condominium management and property management. So there's separate definitions. So just a very high-level timeline of what's gotten us to where we are today. So back in 2013, the government had negotiations and discussions with the Real Estate Council at the time, and it was decided that there was a good fit between what the government was looking for in regulating the condominium management industry and what we did at that time. So we moved forward. In December of 2014, the government made changes to the Real Estate Act to allow for RECA to have the authority to regulate the condominium management industry. But none of that came into force until December of 2020, a little over a year ago, when the changes to the Real Estate Act came into place, and the new council structure was in place as well. And then the actual licensing came into effect as of December 1st, just past 2021. And so it was a soft launch in that everybody was expected to be licensed by December 1st, have their companies and individuals. It didn't fathom that way. It was like herding cats to get everybody in place. And we sort of took the December and January for all the stragglers. And but the cutoff came at the end of January that there was no longer any conditional licensing taking place for condo managers. So the consequences resulting from the regulation of the industry and the government making this a requirement, there's a whole bunch of things that are affected. We've seen the loss of longtime experienced condo managers. So this past fall, there were many managers who had been in the industry for a very long time. I know from personal conversations with many people, there were people in their 70s, there were even a few in their 80s still doing condominium management, and they just didn't want to go forward with the licensing process, and so they've decided to retire. We saw the loss of quite a number of what I would call part-time condo managers, in that there were some people that they might have had property management or real estate sales or some other business as their main line of work, but they managed one or two small condominiums on the side. Of course, in order to continue to do that, they would have had to get licensed and would have had to be working under a brokerage. And they chose that for the amount of work that they were doing in condo management, it wasn't worth it. So they also got out of it. We know that the requirement now for condo managers to be licensed, and in order to get licensed, you have to go through an education and exam process, as well as an eligibility process. So for that all to happen, it changes what used to happen, where condo management companies could just simply hire somebody off the street and do internal training. And I mean, there was nothing preventing a new hire at a condo management company to be sitting in front of a board of directors of a condo corporation within a week or two of being hired previously, whereas now they have to go through the whole education and licensing process before they can actually be doing that. So one of the things that's being looked at by our industry council, both for property management and for condominium management, because property managers, the companies are having the same issue in hiring people. The difficulty of getting people hired and started is that with all the upfront requirements for education and licensing, we're looking at possibly having some kind of a mentoring or staggered licensing process, where the start process is a little easier to get involved, and they can work for either a property management or a condominium management company, and start to learn the ropes at the company. And as they get more and more familiar with things, they can complete a higher level of the licensing requirements, so that it's not all upfront. But that's a work in progress, and we'll see where that goes. Some observations about what was going on prior to RECA overseeing the condominium management industry. There was zero oversight. If anybody had a complaint about a condominium management company, their only place to go was to take legal action previously, or terminate the contract, basically. Government wouldn't step in and deal with any issues, and there was no other body involved. Fly-by-night operators were not uncommon. Somebody decides one day they were just going to open up a business and be a condo manager, and they would undercut fees that were out there in the industry, but they would soon find out that they couldn't survive and operate a business on what they were doing, and then they get out of the industry. So there was a lot of that happening, as well as companies that started up and then just don't do a very good job of things and cause lots of problems, and continue to operate, but just go from corporation to corporation, and lots of problems and issues arise. There were no standards of service, no education required to get into the industry other than what a brokerage or a condo management company might have had internally. Condo boards had nowhere to go when they had problems, nobody to complain to. There were no standards for handling condo corporation funds. And when you consider the tens in Alberta, tens, if not hundreds of millions of dollars that are being held by these companies for operating funds and reserve funds, it's just huge obligations and liabilities. And most condo management companies did not do background checks for employees, which is a concern when you're going to have employees being responsible for handling such large sums of money. So the provincial government decided several years ago, as part of its review of the Condominium Property Act, which increases the protection for condominium unit owners and condominium boards, to establish a regulatory system for condominium managers. And this slide gives an overview of what the impact we believe it will have on the industry and the condominium world in general. So the instituting of licensing structure that includes licensing, education, and eligibility standards. So part of the eligibility standards, of course, is a certain level of education. A clean criminal record check is also important, and identifying the person so that we know we probably have one of the highest standards in Canada of any of the regulatory agencies for identifying individuals who are going to be getting a license. We're very fussy about all their legal names and the criminal record check, taking all that into account to prevent people that are problematic from holding a license. We've set the standard of practice for the industry. We have an extensive set of rules specific to condominium management. and it provides for the regulatory overview of the industry, which includes our trust assurance and practice review program. So that's a program where RECA staff go out and review brokerages, whether it's real estate, mortgage, or condominium, to see that they're abiding by the rules. The record keeping, handling of funds, and other issues are all done according to the requirements under the Act and the regulations. And then we have of course, we have our conduct review and conduct proceedings when there's complaints, so investigations and administrative penalties or hearings, depending on the situation. We have something that, again, many jurisdictions don't have, which is administrative penalties, where we can actually investigate something, and if it's determined that there's been a breach of the legislation, the regulations, or the rules, then we can administer a financial penalty that runs typically from, well, the non-financial penalties, which could be a warning letter or a letter of reprimand, but most administrative penalties start at $1,500 and go up to $25,000 per breach. So we've seen situations in real estate where somebody has breached 5 or 6 different rules and ended up with a penalty of $125,000, $150,000 plus the cost of the hearings. So it's quite significant and quite serious. And of course, that will now apply to the condominium management industry as well. So regulating the condominium management industry will impact the condominium home ownership sector in many ways. So we believe that it'll be much better than that boards and unit owners will know that the condominium management brokerages and managers that they're dealing with are regulated and required to maintain their qualifications, insurance, and licensing. RECA will provide a public registry of brokerages and managers. So you can go to our website today and type in the name of a company, or type in the name of an individual to determine if they're licensed. Or if you're looking for somebody that is in a particular area, you can just type in a municipality, and any brokerages that are practiced in that general area would show up in our database as well. And of course, the standards of practice must be followed, and RECA will be a resource for information regarding standards and practices. And should a condominium corporation or board or unit owner have a complaint about their condominium management brokerage or the condo manager, there is a formal complaint process that's quite robust. A little background on what happened as we rolled this out. I was the main staff person involved in a lot of the preparation that took place prior to December when we started licensing. And it was very difficult over the years that we were working on this project to actually identify who was doing condominium management in Alberta, both from a company and individual's perspective. And I had been able to identify the 165 companies at around 650 individuals, but we knew that wasn't everybody. And so when we started in October, November with the mechanics of the licensing process rolling out, and then coming into December as well, those numbers went up, and there was actually, before we were finished, around 241 companies that were in one way or another involved in condominium management, and about 850 individuals. So as we went through the licensing process, we've now got 190 companies licensed. So that sounds high that there's 61 companies that were identified that didn't get licensed, but for the reasons I mentioned earlier, that they had for not going forward. And the same thing with individuals. We went down from 850 people that appeared to be active in one way or another in the industry down to licensing 621. But we expect that number 621 to eventually end up somewhere in the 725, 750 range, because some people were late and or didn't qualify for the conditional licensing, and so they've had to go through the education process and exams before they can get a license. Then timelines for the next step. So we've put a priority on doing practice reviews with condominium management companies that are brand new to regulation. That's about 65 of the companies that are licensed, have never been regulated by RECA previously. So we're doing in the next 6 months, a review of those companies to make sure they get started off on the right foot with us as a regulator. And then throughout this year, we're going to be doing numerous information sessions, both for the industry and for the public, on what's taking place with condominium management. And then everybody, as Niall mentioned earlier, that gets a conditional license or has gotten a conditional license, because every single person licensed since December 1st has a conditional license, they have to remove those conditions by November 31st of this year. If they don't, then their license is suspended until they do the necessary exams or courses, and then get their license reinstated. And as Niall said, we have a similar structure to real estate industry. We have the brokerage, the company license. We have a broker, the senior person responsible for the operation of the company. And then there are associate brokers that have the same qualifications as the broker and may or may not be involved in management of the company. And then we have associates, and the associates are called condominium manager associates, but they continue to use the term condo manager if that's if they feel more comfortable with that. That's not a problem. The conditional licenses, as Niall said, are all specific to each person. So some people that were licensed with RECA before get a pass on certain requirements and only have to do the practices exam or course and exam. Whereas other people who are new to licensing, if they're an associate, have to do fundamentals and practices. If they're a broker or an associate broker level, they have to do all three, which includes fundamentals, practices, and broker management. And then the licensing exemptions that Niall mentioned, those are pretty straightforward. We were hoping that what was going to happen was there's going to be harmony between Alberta, British Columbia, and Ontario. And I know that's what the governments generally want, but for whatever reason, these were the ones that were approved by the provincial government, and they're pretty straightforward. Niall has already covered them, so I'm not going to go into any detail on those. And that brings me to the end of what I have. And if anybody should have questions or want more details after this webinar, feel free to visit our website or to call me or write me directly, and I'd be more than happy to help you out. So thank you, and I'll turn it back to the chair.
Thanks, Doug. And just a reminder for everyone that if they do have any questions which they'd like to ask anyone on the panel, just feel free to type them into the box, the chat box. We will be answering them at the end of the conversation. Now I would like to turn over to Murray Johnson. We're really excited to hear how Ontario has found their experiences with licensing and where they are 5 years down the road. So Murray.
Thank you. Yeah, we're 5 years into this now, and some things we could predict, much as Doug mentioned in his presentation, but there was a lot of things that surprised us as well. So let me just, I'm just going to jump in and throw a bunch of ideas out there because there's so much going on here. You know, for boards, for the condominium corporations, it wasn't a surprise, not to management, but it certainly was to the boards that the management fees went up. And it went up because once the managers became licensed, they started demanding higher salaries. So that's maybe a benefit to managers while it's a pitfall for boards. And I can tell you that pre-licensing here in Ontario, the average salary for a manager, maybe a 10-year manager, was probably $55,000 to $60,000. And now 5 years in, I think that our average is between 80 and 85,000. And just to give you a little bit more detail, in pre-licensing, we called the high end $70,000 to $80,000 a year. Now I can tell you that I have managers that work for me that are in the range of 100 all the way up to $130,000 a year. So we've come from the poor member of the property management company, and we're starting to catch up with everybody else. So that was a bit of a shock for the boards. But just as Doug mentioned, we saw the same thing here in Ontario. We had about 3,800 managers, condominium managers here in Ontario. And then when licensing came in, we saw that the entry-level licensees in Ontario, we call them limited licensees. That's your apprenticeship level, if you will. They have to take one course, and then they need a couple of years of experience, and then they take other courses along the way. Their license, they're paying about $350 a year for their license. And then it goes up to about $570 a year for a full licensee, what we call a general licensee. And the firms are paying $800 plus $327 per licensed manager in your employ. And I can tell you that in the company that I work for, we've got 340 licensed managers. So you can imagine what our annual fee is. And that was a shock to us. That was a tremendous shock. When you're up into the hundreds of thousands of dollars a year for licensing. Anyway, that was a bit of a pitfall for the firm. Another one that we didn't expect, and this is one that really took us by surprise. We've been wanting for years to be recognized as professionals. We wanted to have that professional designation, and now we have it. Except there comes with that, it's like a double-edged blade. Directors and officers liability insurance indemnifies directors if they follow the advice of a professional. Now, suddenly, if we give advice and they follow it and we're wrong, we're considered a professional. And so our errors and omissions and all of our insurance as a firm have gone through the roof at a time when already insurance has pressures all over it. So that took us by surprise as well. I can tell you that now we have about we've gone from 3,800 to about 2,500 managers. And just as Doug mentioned, those that had 20, 25 years of experience, but didn't have the formal education, they weren't going back to school, and they've left. And then we had some that were what we call transitional. So they had the experience, but they didn't have the education. They had 3 years to get that. They took the 3 years and then they're leaving. So what we see then is the average experience in the industry in Ontario, which was probably around 15, 16, 17 years, has now dropped down to about 10 or 11 years. And so that's a lot of experience that has left the industry. What else can I tell you? In Ontario, we've experienced for years where occasionally there would be a director on a board who would ask us to do something not illegal, but a little shady maybe. And there was this fear that if you say no, they're going to let you go, they're going to fire you, they're going to go down the street and hire a property manager that will do what they want done. And right now in Ontario, we can refuse to do that. We have a code of ethics that we need to follow. I imagine much like the rules that your licensing will have attached to it. And we have no fear in saying, no, we're not going to put our license at risk, knowing full well that if they fire us and go down the street, whoever they hire has to be licensed and has the same code of ethics and will give the same answer. And so it's really leveled the playing field for management firms. So really everybody's sort of coming up in the fees because of the salaries, and everybody, all of the firms and the managers are beginning to understand when it's appropriate to say no, we don't hesitate to say no. One of the things that did arise, because the number of licensed managers is dropping, we have about 12,000 condominium corporations in Ontario and about 2,500 licensed managers. What that means is like it's being a buyer's market when you're in real estate, it's a manager's market in condominium management in Ontario now. And I can tell you that before licensing came in, I would look at a resume and I would interview somebody and I'd say, you know, that's probably a $50,000 or $55,000 manager. Well, that same person with that same experience walking into our company now doesn't even want to go through the interview unless we can guarantee a salary of $85,000 to $90,000. And you can imagine now, if you have a good contract lined up and you need to staff it, you need to raise the fee so you can pay the money to put that manager at that site. It's created a real problem out there, and that puts another level of onus on the firm. When you're hiring managers and you know that 5 years ago, it was worth 50. Now you're paying them 85. They get a little brave. They're out there. The oversight for the staff has been considerable for the firms because the firm wants to protect their license as well. And the firm ultimately ends up being responsible for the way the managers are here in Ontario. So it's really been, a learning curve for all of us. And I can tell you, so the firms, they're managing the managers' activities more closely. That means they're most of them here have taken on the job of developing very detailed standard operating procedures and then measuring performance against those procedures because of the risk of maybe not losing your license right away, but you get enough complaints against a company's license or a manager's license, you start to get a reputation with the regulator. We take it seriously as a management company because with 340 managers and a staff of about 550 in our company, if we lose our license, there's a lot of people who lose their jobs. So we don't want that to happen. What's interesting too in Ontario is our license at roughly 550, 560 a year, but a nurse or a lawyer in Ontario for their license is paying 200 a year. It's I think a little bit lopsided there. Well, question will come up now. I see the numbers are considerably different in terms of the number of managers and the number of companies in Alberta. But now here, an employer of choice is an employer that's willing to pay for the manager's license each year. And that might be okay if you've got 4 or 5 managers, but if you're like we are and you've got 340, we don't do that. And so a lot of those managers out there will say, well, if I just go down the street to the smaller company, they'll pay my license for me. I can tell you too that with the older and experienced managers leaving the industry, once they're out, they don't want to come back. Doug mentioned it before. This is a tough job to do, managing condominiums. And when you're in it and you're successful at it, it's very gratifying. But the ones that have left told me when you're out of it, it's a big relief. So a lot of them aren't even coming back as consultants to help us out. There's certainly more education. One level of education we didn't expect was how difficult it was going to be to get managers, as Doug said, that previously you could just hire off the street, put in there, mentor them a little bit, and a week later they're managing a condominium corporation, millions of dollars of assets. We've had to put in extensive education to make managers understand how important it is to stay within the guidelines and the rules and the code of ethics. It's not like the old days. You really have to be careful that you're protecting your livelihood. We have a public registry, so the disciplinary arm of our regulatory authority. They have a public registry, and I can tell you, I look at that thing, and every week I see the list of names growing and growing and growing. Some of them have suspended licenses. Some of them have fines. I think the highest fine I've seen so far is $8,000 on a manager. There's managers who have lost their license, and there are firms, much like what you saw, that said, no, we've got 3 condominium corporations. We're not going to go through all of this regulatory nonsense, and they've just dropped those smaller clients out. That means that the people that are left are larger companies, and none of the larger companies want to take on a 10-unit condominium corporation. So there's a lot of people out there that are now self-managed as a result of this. And so it behooves the industry to be prepared to help those self-managed condominiums because they're disconnected. They're outside of the loop. One of the things we found, and this is something that really bothered me, that there's no protection for managers from fraudulent claims against them. So if somebody puts in a complaint against a manager and it is clearly blatant and untrue, and it's just a disgruntled owner or even a director, and then there's an investigation and they say, okay, there's no foundation, we're going to close the file. there's no recourse on the manager or the principal, we call it the principal license, the firm, being able to go back after that individual. And I understand it's going to be the same where you are. So it's like managers are now walking around with a bullseye on their back. The other side of that is they're getting paid well to wear that bullseye. So it's maybe not as bad. What else can I tell you? The fees and the cost to the managers tends to be enormous. And then, lately when you throw in COVID and physical distancing and all those different aspects, and I know each of the provinces has been up and down in terms of how bad it's been. We're just starting to come out of it now, but boy, we were getting beat up bad because we closed management offices in the buildings. We limited access to the manager. It was physically distanced, all those sorts of things. And a lot of complaints went in because it wasn't unusual for a manager to point to somebody. Our provincial regulation requires masks in the common areas at all times. To go up to somebody and say, you need to wear a mask, and then tomorrow to have a complaint against you at the regulatory authority. So there's a lot of things here that you can expect. And I was reading your slide, Doug, with great interest because you caught some of the ones that we had predicted. Wasn't a surprise, but we certainly didn't expect to lose as many managers, and we didn't expect the average level of experience to drop so drastically. We in Ontario, we have one more big wave coming, and that's the majority of the managers right now are in the 55 to 65 year age. And so we expect that starting in about 5 years, we're going to see all of those senior people start to drop out of the industry. And that scares me for the residents, because it means that the people managing them will probably have an average of 6 or 7 years experience. And I can tell you, I was nowhere near the manager I am now when I was 6 years managing. I've got 30 years, almost 30 years under my belt, and it's taken that long to almost learn my trade. But anyway, those are the big issues that I saw. There are some other little ones that pop up. I think that boards are going to end up paying more money, but you're going to get a better level of manager. You're going to get a manager that understands what the proper ethics and processes are. The firms are going to have to put in place more strict protocols and oversight, which is only going to be a benefit to the condominium corporations. But everybody's going to have to work for it. And the one thing that we have seen, and I'll leave you with this, is that while the bar is being raised and people are beginning to understand the conditions on them by the Code of Ethics, the cost is there. It hasn't been a cheap transition in Ontario. There you go. Back to you.
And I'd like to thank both you so much. So we do have a variety of questions. Murray, I'm going to throw the first one to you, if that's okay. The question is, how have you found the process of recruiting new managers has changed in Ontario?
Yeah, well, I mean, we use every means of social media and job fairs and things like that. But I mean, it's such a specialized skill set to do what we do, and you really do have to have thick skin to do what we do. I always say, you have to have tact, and tact is the ability to tell someone to go to hell in such a way that they look forward to the trip, right? We interview administrators and managers, probably about 10 of each every week, and we probably hire about one a month, and that makes it very, very difficult. We have tremendous growth because we also work with new construction, and if you follow condominiums, you know that downtown Toronto is the center of the universe for constructions of new condos, and we're picking up maybe one a week. And so it's really, really tough getting managers. There are licensed ones, but a licensed manager with 2 years experience, you can't put them into an 80-story building. You just can't. So it's been tough. It's been really, really hard.
And next question is a question for Doug. What is the complaint process going to look like for condo boards going forward?
So a condo board would have to put their complaint in writing typically, and their concerns. An investigator on our staff would be assigned and to look into whether or not the condominium management brokerage or condo manager breached any of the rules or practices that are specified. If it's not within, if in the initial look at the complaint, because as Murray mentioned, there's lots of frivolous complaints that take place. We've been used to dealing with that in real estate, and our typical record has been roughly half to 60% of all complaints that come in don't go any further because they're either frivolous, there's no facts to substantiate whatever the complaint is being made about, or it's not truly a complaint about the condo manager. It's really somebody else that they should be going to. But if the complaint does go forward and it's investigated, then depending on the nature of the issue, in most cases, if it's investigated and it's found that there is a breach of some kind, depending on the level of the breach, it could be simply an advisory note to say in the future, you shouldn't be doing that way, or you need to do whatever. And then a letter of reprimand would be, because an advisory note doesn't go on their disciplinary history, whereas anything above that, a letter of reprimand or administrative penalty would go on their discipline history and would be public and show up on our website. Actually, if you searched up somebody, it would actually show if they've had any discipline against them. So and then again, according to the seriousness of the issue, if it's basic breaches, it's typically going to be like a $1,500 or $2,000 fine. Could be, if there are multiple breaches, it could be multiple fines on the same issue. And then if it was a much more serious nature, or the person disagreed with administrative penalties, it would end up at a hearing where there'd be an actual tribunal that would hear all the facts and make a decision. So that's the process.
And a follow-up question for Murray, kind of in the same scope of area. Where are you, in Ontario, where are you seeing the areas of complaints coming from? Has it changed since the regulation requirements were introduced, or are they largely in the same areas?
I think they're in the same areas. One of the clauses in licensed code of ethics in Ontario is that you will act in a professional manner. And that's like saying that the reserve fund should be adequate. What is the definition of that? And so again, the one thing that most residents who come down to complain or call the management company to complain, they're not looking for you to say no. They want to hear yes. They want what they want. So when you say no, it's not unusual that an owner now, where they might have sent an email to your boss before, they send it off to the regulatory authority. So the one thing that was a surprise to us is the authority tells us that they're beginning to build profiles on chronic complainers. So, we know that, some condos have that one chronic complainer. They grab you in the elevator from the lowest level of parking all the way up to the penthouse, tear a strip off of the directors or whoever. But the number of complaints they put in and the number that were determined to be frivolous has started to build a really detailed profile. So sometimes if the complaint comes against you from one of those people, you have a pretty good shot already because it's already leaning in your favor.
Thanks, Murray. And we've had a few questions in or around this general area. A question for Doug next. Are conduct reviews and conduct proceedings, are they going to change under the new regulations, or are they staying the same as previously?
The same format goes in place that's been in place for both real estate and mortgage brokerage.
Thanks. For Murray, is there a typical amount that Ontario management fees have increased to?
Well, again, the way that my company sets a fee is we ask the board what level of manager do you want? Are you happy with an entry level, 5-year, 10-year? Do you want a senior level manager? Do you want a manager and an administrator? Do you want a manager, an assistant manager, and an administrator? Once we know what the staffing model is, we can start to build our price. So in that sense, we always start with what our hard costs as an employer are, and then attach our overhead on that. So there, as salaries go up, if salaries went up 5% a year, then our fees were going up between 5 and 6% a year.
And then a follow-up question that I noted from hearing you talk earlier was, there was a big drop-off in the management of smaller condominium corporations. Has there been any firms that have started to specialize in managing smaller condos, or are smaller condos largely moving to a self-managed model?
I would say they're largely moving to a self-managed model. What we're beginning to find, and it's a phenomenon that's always been there, but when you're trying to stay within the scope of your license and trying to protect your license and still do the best job you can for the client, what we find is that even a half-time project for us, so that would be a manager that has 2 properties. Each of those properties want 100% of the manager's time, even though the contract says that you're going to get half time. And we have these things that are called drive-bys. Might be 20 townhouses or something. You drive by it, make sure everything's okay. They still want 100% of the manager's time. You're still creating financial statements. You're still going to board meetings. You're still all of those tasks are still there. So there's a tendency now, I think, to say with a lot of the companies that the managers will have 1 or 2 properties. And so when you think about that, you really have to have a large client base to start turning the profits that you used to have. One of the things that used to happen in Ontario is we would have a very experienced site administrator sitting in a building as the building manager, and have an experienced property manager, condominium manager, that would act like a regional and drive to each of the sites and could manage 6-7 sites that way. But under the new regulations and the definition of what is a condominium management service, it has to be a licensed individual. So that model has now gone away. And so some of the companies, when they couldn't operate that way, they simply closed their doors.
Right.
Niall, an aside that I like last week, I had a long conversation with a condominium manager who's been at it for a while and worked for a larger company previously, then opened their own sort of boutique shop and was doing exactly what you're talking about, which was providing services to smaller condo corps that, were, I mean, the smallest ones we have, I don't know if it happens in Ontario, but we have in Edmonton area where they've condominiumized 2 units, like semi-detached. And it was done because builders were instead of having to put a separate set of services in from the street, so there'd be services to each unit side by side, they went with the one set of services from the street to feed both units, but it created it as a condominium. So that's been happening the last few years, and that's going to be huge headaches down the road. But this particular broker has a boutique operation and aimed at small, like 4-unit to 12-unit condo corps. But she was quite honest with me and said she doesn't know if she's done the right thing, because she thinks it's going to be difficult to turn a buck, because the very reasons that Murray's speaking to, which is people, no matter how big you are or what you're paying, they demand a lot more than what they're paying for.
Exactly.
Doug, I have another question for you, actually, which is, how is RECA handling the probationary period for condo managers who went on maternity leave just prior to the conditional licensing being approved?
Well, there wasn't anything allowed for that, to tell you the truth. It was up to individuals in the industry, and we've been emailing and sending out stuff and publishing lots of information for a year and a half, with a real emphasis starting back in July. We actually opened up the eligibility process on the 3rd of August, so that people who were in the condominium management industry, because it was a 2-step process, because we were doing conditional licensing, they had to first prove that they were eligible for a license. So they had to meet, their ability to work legally in Canada, to get through the criminal record check process, provide us with an affirmation of their condominium management experience. And then licensing opened up on the 12th of October after we finished, because we have an annual licensing cycle that ends on September 30th. So once we got clear of the renewals for the other 15,000 people that we license in other industries, we opened up the door for the condo managers to get licensed. So people had, lots of time in advance to start the process. So if somebody was going to be going out on maternity leave, there was no excuse for them not going through the eligibility process and getting everything in line, so that once the conditional licenses were being issued as of December 1st, they could have had a conditional license issued and then put it on hold. But we're running into a few people. There's probably somewhere around 50 or 60 people for various reasons, not just maternity, that fall into that boat, that they didn't do anything in advance. And then the licensing period, they were supposed to be licensed by December 1st, but because it was treated as a soft launch, this stretched, as I said earlier, into December and January. And as a result, the registrar cut off, and the industry council cut off all further issuance of conditional license at the end of January. So if somebody wasn't paying attention and not doing what they needed to do in advance, then they're now in the situation where before they can start back at work as a condo manager, would have to complete the necessary courses and exams before being issued a license.
And there's a couple of questions coming in around education and ongoing education. Murray, what are the continuing education requirements in Ontario?
They're still working those out. We're waiting to hear. We know that the courses. I don't know if you're familiar out there. I think some of the firms might be with the RCM designation, Registered Condominium Manager, originated in Ontario. So if you had that, then you were grandfathered into a full general license. They've since added more courses, and which is great, because they're spending more time teaching ethics and that sort of thing rather than the mechanics of being a manager. So we're waiting to see what it is. But one thing that you come in as a limited licensee, so that's the apprenticeship level. You've had one course. You have to have 2 years of experience and the education before you can apply for your general license. And the interesting thing about that is that's 2 years of actually working. So you don't include Saturdays, you don't include Sundays. I think 2,090 hours or 2,900 hours, something like that. You don't include stat holidays. You don't include your vacation time. And so your supervisor really has to track your time very, very carefully, because they have to sign off and acknowledge that you've met that condition.
And for Doug, what are the ongoing education requirements going to look like in Alberta?
Well, we still don't know for sure what it'll look like on the condo side. I mean, every single person licensed right now has the requirements to remove conditions. So anywhere from 1 to 3 exams or courses. And as we move forward, if we follow the same pattern that we have both with the mortgage industry and the real estate industry, typically we try to have a continuing education course every second year or every second licensing cycle. And so I wouldn't be surprised, actually, because the next licensing cycle will start on October 1st, I wouldn't be the least bit surprised if next year we have a continuing education course for condominium management, because they're new to us and new to regulation. And we probably need to have something that at a high level deals with a lot of the most common issues, misunderstandings that are we identify this first year taking place, to try to clean up a lot of things. So if we don't do it in the next licensing cycle, then we're pretty sure we would do it in the following licensing cycle.
And for another question came in. So for those future cycles, so obviously the education requirements are going to be provided by third parties in Alberta. Can you just talk about what the ongoing review of those third party providers will look like?
Well, from RECA's perspective, the only thing that we do is require the third party education providers to develop and maintain courses that cover off all the learning competencies and learning outcomes that are specified in the materials that they're provided when they're developing their courses. It was interesting, government, it's my understanding that government did not give RECA the ability to actually look at the quality of the courses from that perspective. As long as the courses taught what's required in the learning outcomes, then that's the requirement from our perspective. Now, what will happen over time, it's because it's unusual, because in most provinces you only have one course provider for each licensing course, typically. But over time, if we continue to have multiple course providers for the same courses, RECA will be publishing the exam results for people who take the various courses. So if it turned out that it was a particular course wasn't very effective at helping people to get through the exam process, that will show up in the exam results afterwards, and may lead people to go to a different course. Other people getting in when they see what the ratings are.
Okay, and one for Doug, are you aware of the average number of units per condo in Alberta?
No, we're not. There's and I'm quite surprised that the numbers aren't greatly different. We understand there's close to 10,000 condominium corporations in Alberta, and but we have no sense of how many are small ones versus big ones, or high rise versus 2 or 3 story units and that sort of thing. So there's just been a huge lack of information. So I'm hopeful that that might be one of the projects that we'll take on down the road, is sort of identifying what the condominium management industry in Alberta looks like. It'd be a tremendous job for a university student project to take on.
Interesting. In Ontario, we have the Condominium Authority of Ontario. So you've got one regulator that's sort of overseeing condominiums, and then you've got the regulatory authority that oversees the licensing of managers. And in Ontario, each corporation is required to file a return with their regulatory authority, the CAO. And in that return, they confirm the number of units, the type they are, is a townhouse, mixed use, high rise, whatever it might be. And there's a whole bunch of questions that are done there. Interestingly enough, there is a fee that has to be paid by the condominium to the Condominium Authority of Ontario, and that's based on the number of residential units in the condominium. So if you're a high rise with 250 units, it's currently $1 per door per month. So it's $250 a month. So when they put that in place, and all of the corporations had to fill out these annual returns, we started to get the data in. And I know that pre-registration or pre-licensing and pre-CAO, we were, I think, somewhere around 140 units on average. And that's taking in some of the rural areas, some of the smaller condos, right to downtown Toronto with the big ones. And now I think we're up about 280. I know I have 3 client condominium corporations that are over 1,100 units.
Okay, thanks for that information. So it does look like we've run out of time today. I'd like to thank everyone for attending, everyone who asked questions. I'd like to thank them as well. I would also like to thank the panel for their involvement, and also our sponsors. So CondoVoter, this is an electronic platform which provides simple, secure, seamless electronic voting and virtual meeting solutions for condominiums, stratas, and associations. and also Max TV Media, which elevates condominium and strata communities through digital interactive screens in elevators, lobbies, and common areas. And I'd also like to thank participants in this session to keep an eye out for our next CAI discussion, which should be coming up shortly. Thank you everyone for attending, and have a good day.
Did we get to all the questions?
We got to virtually all of them, yes.
Oh, good.
One question we didn't get to.
Murray, when you were answering the question about the identifying the units and the fact that the corporations had to file a report, in Alberta, they only have to file a report after their AGM with the list of the directors and contact information and who the point of contact, whether it's the president or a management company. But government does nothing to enforce that. So very large number of corporations never ever send that information into land titles, and they and we know there's lots of management companies that weren't doing it previously. With that, we'll be able to clean up the part with the management companies, but not what the self-managed are doing. And
yeah, and they're the ones that need it the most. They need the most help. You know, I'm really worried about the small self-managed condominium. Typically, I mean, in Ontario, if you don't get paid for providing management services, as it would be in a self-managed, then you don't have to be licensed. But the smaller ones aren't paying their directors to take courses and to stay in the loop and be active